In the 1920s and 30s, two great car manufacturers and their drivers dominated a new sport which excited millions with the thrill of speed. From Britain, the Bentley, driven by its team of flamboyant millionaires who, when they weren't partying, won almost every race there was to win in Europe.
Well, there was no need to go any faster. There's nobody to beat.
Well, we had nobody to beat but ourselves.
In Germany, Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, with encouragement from the Nazi government, designed and built a new generation of sports cars conceived with only one thing in mind: to be the best. In the battle to be the fastest, the prize was not only laurels to the victor, but great national prestige. This was the era that saw the birth of modern motor racing. Ever since the earliest days of motoring, there were races and competitions to be the fastest. And as soon as the first person drove a motor car at speed, someone else wanted to race and win.
If you drive at 200 miles an hour in an open cockpit, it feels like 500, just because you're in the elements and you're experiencing the wind coming against you and even the sound. I mean, that's something for me which I really get a buzz from. It's just to listen to the engine note of race cars, you know, when you're sitting there and knowing that you've got control under your right foot. It makes you powerful and your chest grows and you think, poof, you know, you're the man.
One of the first great British racing drivers was Sammy Davis. At the 1929 Brooklands 500-mile race, Davis and his teammates swept away the competition in their massive Bentleys. These enormously powerful machines reached speeds of over 120 miles per hour. Later, Davis described the feeling of being behind the wheel of a Bentley.
After 3 laps, I opened up full and watched for tricks. The wind howled like hosts of demons. The big car, throbbing with animal life, simply flew. Verily, the car was alive. Time after time, it seemed to laugh, gather itself together, and jump from the banking at a pace that really thrilled. As wild a race as ever a Valkyrie dreamed, from the musical roar of exhaust behind to the howl of wind past the small oil-stained screen.
But motor racing didn't develop overnight. Only 10 years earlier, these cars and the speeds they attained would have seemed an impossible dream. In the early 1920s, the motor car was just becoming the great invention that would help shape the 20th century and be responsible for a new industrial revolution. In the United States, Henry Ford had shown the way by starting to mass-produce motor cars. Huge numbers of cars rolled off the production lines. Ultimately, the workers would also become the consumers in a growing cycle of wealth.
Certainly the 1920s, or the vintage period, was a time when a middle-class person, a blue-collar worker, somebody like a bank clerk, could actually conceivably buy a car of their own and thereby buy into this extraordinary new thing which was called freedom of the road.
It worked. Vast numbers of people had their first driving experience in these new mass-produced cars. And by the late 20s, there were nearly 1 million cars on the road in Britain.
It was opening up an ability for individuals and families to go much further afield from their hometown or village that had never ever been envisaged before. So a day down on the beach was no longer something you dreamt about. The wherewithal was outside, sitting in a little garage or on the drive. It might take you a long time, it was certainly uncomfortable, but you'd get there in the end.
With all these new cars on the road, there was one thing that still held them back: a 20 miles per hour speed limit, which had been in force for many years. But it was a law that few respected.
Legislation is on the books, There was a 20-mile limit, but they got tired of observing it. Probably for that very reason. They didn't want to hold the industry back. So people could build very fast cars.
The 20 miles per hour speed limit was finally scrapped in 1931. But the motor industry had already come up with a new type of car to challenge the speed limits. A car designed to appeal to men. The sports car.
The invention of the sports car was a really exciting development in terms of motoring history, because they didn't really exist before the First World War. The only people who could afford them were extremely wealthy, game young sort of chaps at university who just thrashed from between the university campus and their home in Grosvenor Square. That's what early sports car motoring was all about. Fabulously fast, incredibly dangerous, and usually driven by irresponsible rich kids. Marvellous.
Soon MG, Sunbeam, Wolseley, Singer, Riley, Talbot all began to sell cars which offered a sporty image and much more speed than the average family saloon.
Sports cars were principally for show-offs. That was the real reason for having one. And there are many a tale of young chaps in their little MGM types and so on who would park outside the local factory waiting for the gals to come out and so on, and they'd all be sitting there looking all frightfully attractive in their sports cars.
The average family car would find it difficult to reach 40 miles per hour, but these new sports cars could flash along at 60 miles per hour or more. As roads began to improve, taking the car out for a spin became the way in which many people had direct access for the first time to the excitement of speed. Many drivers enjoyed taking part in organized events, hill climbs, trials, or village races. Anyone could join in and assess their own car and performance against others.
In terms of actually undertaking competitive sport, things like hill climbs and trialling, to this day seem slightly absurd, where you have a muddy track up the side of a hill and thrash your device as hard as you can up it to try and get there quicker than anybody else. And that usually involved putting people on the back and bouncing up and down the suspension so the wheels get some kind of traction, and basically abusing the thing horribly. But an awful lot of fun, so it was the beginning of motorsport in that respect.
For most people, the car was a way to get from one place to another. But some drivers had different ideas and were adapting and developing cars to drive much faster than they could ever hope to go on normal roads. Brooklands in Surrey had been opened as Britain's only racing circuit before World War I. But racing at Brooklands soon became a social event and began to attract that breed of privileged young men who had time on their hands and money to spare.
They had bank holiday meetings there, short handicap races, they had bookies there. The public loved it. If you didn't go to a horse race or watch a tennis match, you went to Brooklands. Then they had the slogan, the right crowd, no crowding. People thought it's a nice place to go. We can take our wives, take our children. There's a hill there, we picnic, watch the racing from some distance away. A splendid place.
At the time, road racing was banned in Britain, and only racing on closed-off circuits was allowed. But on the continent of Europe, things were different. In France, Italy and Germany, road races were the norm, and many manufacturers looked on these events as a way to advertise their cars.
Racing actually in Germany for Daimler started in 1899. We participated in our first race in Nice at the Côte d'Azur, and from that moment Daimler realized that to win races is the best advertising you can do. And from that moment on, they always started to select certain events where they can demonstrate either the power and the speed of a car or the longevity of a car, the reliability, which was a very important fact at that time because cars were not as reliable as they were today.
Back in Britain, one group of drivers began to look enviously at the international stage in which to compete. They wanted to take a large car built for wealthy aristocrats and head for the French racetrack of Le Mans. The car they wanted to race was the Bentley. Known simply as the Bentley Boys, they would become legends in their day. Together with the car, they would change the face of British motor racing forever. By the early 1920s, motor racing had captured the public imagination. And unlike Britain, which had banned road races, the French authorities actively supported the motor car. Located in the Loire Valley, the little town of Le Mans had played a leading role in motorsport since the beginning of the century. But in 1923, the organizers created a 24-hour race as a test of endurance for standard saloon cars. Rather than race on an enclosed circuit, Le Mans was to be raced on 10 miles of public roads.
The idea was a race which would really test cars, even the lighting system, so it was a 24-hour race. So I had a race with lamps on after dark to test electrical apparatus, which wasn't all that good then. The cars had to do 24 hours at reasonably fast speeds to win the race. It was a very important race to the French, and other manufacturers realised it was a jolly good advertisement anyway. They were a jolly good test ground, so they began to get jolly good entries.
In Britain, a wealthy car enthusiast called John Duff decided to race his own 3-litre Bentley and contacted the boss of the company, W.O. Bentley, for assistance in preparing his car for the race. At the time, W.O. had never heard of Le Mans.
Bentley's initial reaction was that he didn't think that there was any motor car that could possibly stand the strain of racing for 24 hours. He thought the whole thing was bizarre.
Walter Owen Bentley, forever known as W.O., was born in 1888, and after school was apprenticed as a railway engineer. Soon his love of speed and engines drew him to race motorcycles.
During his 5-year apprenticeship at Doncaster, W.O. clearly developed a real passion for motorcycles and indeed for speed. But I think 2 things were happening to W.O. during this period. One was the fact that he was ever improving upon the performance of these motorcycles, and 2, I mean, without doubt, speed was getting into W.O.'s blood.
In 1912, W.O. left the railways and with his brother bought the concession of the French car company DFP. In World War I, W.O. became a Royal Naval officer and helped design lightweight aircraft engines. One of his most successful engines powered the Sopwith Camel. Thousands were built, and the Camel became the ubiquitous Allied fighter aircraft of the war.
During the war, W.O. had made up his mind that, as far as he was concerned, he didn't want to get back into the agency business with the DFP. And being an innovative engineer, he'd just taken the view that, right, it's time to develop my own car. Bentley Motors were formed in July of 1919, and by October of the same year, the first Bentley engine had actually roared into life.
Once into production, W.O. Bentley's experience with the railways came into practice. Weighing in at nearly 2 tons and over 12 feet in length, these Goliaths were built like steam trains. The engines ranged from 3 to 8 litres and were capable of over 100 miles per hour. It was as if the Bentley was taking on a life of its own.
If you were a child's author, you would probably try and personify a Bentley, and it would have big eyes in front. It's got a tall forehead. It makes sort of noises you'd expect to hear. Whereas some of the more sleek, technologically efficient cars, hiding all their engineering under their polished aluminium bodywork, didn't grip the imagination.
Bentley also firmly believed in making his cars as safe as possible.
Nothing was too much trouble. Everything split-pinned, everything checked. Everybody knew that that motor car was correct and that they'd actually staked their life on it.
In 1923, and knowing W.O.'s resistance to entering a race they might not win, John Duff decided to set off and drive to the French circuit of Le Mans. At the last minute, W.O. offered Frank Clement as his co-driver.
Clement was actually the test driver for Bentley, so he was allowed to go. I imagine Duff said, "Oh, it's your weekend off, I give you, come with me."
But that evening, W.O. made another momentous decision.
At the last minute, Bentley decided he ought to go, so he went by boat and train. Can you imagine boat and train to try and get to a race that's almost started? But I suppose it wasn't going on for 24 hours.
W.O. arrived on June the 21st, the longest day of the year, and what he saw enormously impressed him.
As night fell, with the acetylene lamps shining onto the corners of the track, Le Mans was getting into his blood. And before long, he was suggesting that it was by far and away the most exciting race he'd ever seen in his life.
The main principle of Le Mans was to race normal domestic cars just as if they were on the road. No car could race unless there were 50 models in production. For the first 20 laps, the cars had to have their hoods up. They also had to carry all their tools and to have lead weights fitted equal to 3 passengers.
Le Mans chucks at you every single thing. You might have rain, sleet, hailstones, fog. 4 o'clock in the morning, you're tired and it's pitch black.
Racing in appalling weather, John Duff's Bentley came fourth and set the fastest lap at an average of 67 miles per hour. W.O. was ecstatic. He was also convinced that this was the way to exhibit his cars and go out and wave the flag for Britain.
The Bentley team were very much that way inclined. In the days when we weren't ashamed to be patriotic and wave the flag, I certainly think there would have been a great following for Bentley, much the same way as the Italians follow Ferrari today.
Throughout 1923 and into 1924, Bentley and his team improved the cars, but these thoroughbreds were not for the ordinary man. Costing between £1,000 and £2,000, which could have bought you a row of terraced houses, only the very wealthy could afford them. Many of the drivers had been fighter pilots in World War I. Flying in the war had developed in some a taste for speed and danger. After the war, these men found peacetime boring and looked around for new thrills. Ex-fighter pilot Tim Birkin spoke for many.
Civilian life afforded none of the excitements of the career I was leaving. Each day would seem more vapid and tedious than the last.
But with their money, they could now take part in the new sport of fast, long-distance racing. Driving their own cars, these men took the motor racing world by storm.
Those guys back then were like the modern-day gladiators. They went out into the arena, and that arena was a race circuit, and they tried to harness the power of a race car, which, in all respects, was a beast.
Wherever there were endurance races, the powerful Bentleys took the honours. Soon the name Bentley was everywhere.
During the 20s, the Bentley tradition encapsulated the spirit of an age. Bentley and sports car almost became synonymous. Anybody who saw a sports car in England during the 1920s, irrespective of make or model, immediately thought, Christ, there's a Bentley. And it was that sort of spirit that captured the imagination of the public.
Industrialists, socialites, royalty. Everyone wanted a Bentley. Life was getting faster and faster, and Bentley reflected the mood of the age known as the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of jazz, wild parties, and where speed was king. The men who raced these cars lived life just as fast and became celebrities overnight. Diamond mine owner Wolf Bonato, Baronet Sir Henry Tim Birkin, Harley Street physician John Bengerfield, motor racing journalist Sammy Davis, and ex-submarine officer Glenn Kidston became idols of the public. Together, they were called the Bentley Boys.
Well, the Bentley Boys were supposed to inhabit the very best flats in London, go out with the most beautiful girls from stage and screen, and nightclubs and all that type of thing, and you wonder how they ever found time to drive cars in competition.
Grosvenor Square, millionaires, parties in the best hotels, girls all over the place.
Parties figured high on the Bentley Boys' list of priorities, and some of the best were those thrown by millionaire Wolf Bonato.
My father was always surrounded with people in Grosvenor Square, and he had a house at Lingfield, Ardenron, and that was always full of wonderful-looking people. As a small child, I was made a tremendous fuss of by all these wonderful people who were rather like the pop stars of today. They were lauded, everybody wanted to talk to them, to touch them, to see how they were.
They were incredibly wealthy. They were sporting men of independent means. They had a string of Bentleys, they played the stock market, they owned racehorses, they had a string of mistresses. And for a number of these guys, I mean, that was pretty well close to the truth.
Wolf Bonato's parties would go on from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., with men and women racing up and down his drive. Bonato was said to have spent between £10,000 and £15,000 a week on enjoying himself. They might have known how to have a good time, but the Bentley Boys were also dedicated sportsmen. The honour of winning was everything. In 1924, in only the second year of competing at Le Mans, the race was theirs when John Duff and Frank Clement won in a 3-litre Bentley. A new era of victory and success was opening up for Bentley. Over the next 2 years, W.O. worked tirelessly in developing the cars. Everybody was dedicated to the development of speed. The Bentley team looked increasingly invincible. But elsewhere in Europe, other cars were also developing a reputation for speed. In 1926, a Mercedes driven by 22-year-old Rudolf Caracciola won the German Grand Prix. His victory and the car he was driving now sounded alarm bells within the Bentley racing team. By the mid-1920s, the Le Mans 24-hour race had become established as the international showcase for car manufacturers. But the French Bugattis and the Italian Alfa Romeos and Maseratis were simply not powerful and strong enough to challenge the British Bentley. Ettore Bugatti's frustration reflected what many designers felt about the Bentley.
Bugatti said they were heavy lorries, and of course they were compared to the Bugattis, like a ballerina against a solo opera singer. You could see it. I mean, you put a lightweight Bugatti, was probably passed or as fast as the Bentley against this great, enormous, probably 4-seater thing. You say that's what he meant.
But it was the Stuttgart-based company of Daimler-Benz that would provide the principal challenge. Since 1901, Daimler had called their cars Mercedes to overcome sales resistance from the vital but anti-German French market. Soon the new name was becoming known as a fast sports car.
The first Grand Prix which Daimler participated in was in 1903, the so-called Gordon Bennett race, which is more or less the grandmother of the Grand Prix.
Over the following years, the Mercedes, powered by huge 120-horsepower engines, won more and more races. This culminated in a first, second, and third at the 1914 French Grand Prix. By the mid-1920s, Daimler-Benz had introduced a new line of sports cars. Powered by a supercharged 2-litre engine and capable of massive speeds, these cars looked like a new breed that might challenge Bentley's supremacy. In 1926, Mercedes' new cars shook the Bentley team when an unknown 22-year-old driver called Rudolf Caracciola won the German Grand Prix. Racing in pouring rain, Caracciola demonstrated the huge power that Mercedes could bring to the racetrack. Shortly afterwards, Daimler-Benz introduced into their stable of thoroughbreds their new SSK sports car. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche, who later founded his own stable of motor racing legends, this 7-litre, 120 miles per hour supercharged car would throw down the gauntlet to Bentley's dominance.
I mean, nothing more impressive, my goodness. 38 250 supercharged Mercedes, bonnet about 10 feet long. Outside exhaust pipes, 120 miles an hour virtually guaranteed. Bentley of 110s. Oh yes, of course an exciting car. But not perhaps quite as reliable as it need have been, or the way people drove it. We'd certainly buy a Mercedes if we didn't buy a Bentley.
But the Bentley boys didn't let Mercedes' success get them down. For them, 1927 was the start of a golden age when the Bentley giants would reign supreme. To get that little bit extra, WO even devised a system to film their pit stops to improve performance.
Pit stops can win a race. You may not be the fastest car on the race circuit, but if you have a smooth set of pit stops and you have a very organised crew, you can save valuable seconds. That adds up to minutes when it comes to 24 hours. So people who are ahead of themselves in sort of vision and looking at pit stops, for example, like WO Bentley, were already getting the advantage over everybody else down the pit lane.
And it paid off. Bentley won the 1927 Le Mans, and at a celebratory dinner at the Savoy Hotel, there was a very special guest. The winning car, still dirty from its drive from Le Mans. The guests sat around and toasted it with champagne. The 1928 Le Mans continued the Bentley boys' incredible run of successes. Wolf Bonato, convinced of the Bentley's superiority, made a bet with the American Stutz team on who had the best sports car in the world.
Bonato clearly enjoyed a flutter and decided to have a wager of £1,000 with the Stutz people. They said, fine, we'll take you on, but we'd like you to race at Indianapolis. So Bonato said, well, look, I'm sorry, but fair's fair, old boy. We'll have to race at Le Mans. That's the only place to race.
Bonato won his first Le Mans in car number 4 and collected his £1,000. Not content with this, he then took on the famous French Blue Train in a unique challenge.
My father down the south of France, and they had a wager that my father would get to Calais before the Blue Train. So they set off at the same time. Anyway, he beat the train to Calais. And then they lost to England, and he went back to London and had a bath and put a fresh carnation in his buttonhole. And they'd made a splendid record.
The 1929 Le Mans was to be the scene of Bentley's greatest victory. Now racing even bigger 4.5-litre and 6-litre cars, they smashed all the opposition.
Bentley swept the board. They came 1, 2, 3 and 4th. So much so that they were so dominant by the last lap that WO Bentley slowed all the cars down, so effectively they almost crossed the line together. It was quite a magnificent sight.
It's a huge deal. I mean, it really is a huge deal. To actually get to the end of a 24-hour event and you get this whole run of emotions, and by the time you get to the end of it, you're physically and mentally drained, but when you've won and you stand up on the podium, and to this day I can still see the Union Jacks flying underneath, the crowd roaring. I'm never going to forget that.
But with the triumph of Le Mans still fresh in their minds, 1929 began to herald a change in fortunes for Bentley. The 20s were drawing to a close, and with worldwide economic depression setting in, few could afford to buy expensive cars anymore. But more seriously for the racing giants of Britain, the German-developed supercharged car was having a big impact on engine design.
The power of the engine is really determined on how much fuel and air you can get inside the cylinders. But for racing, you needed some way of pumping in additional air and fuel so that each cylinder was absolutely crammed full of an explosive mixture.
W.O. Bentley was violently opposed to the use of superchargers and felt that these additions were against the Bentley ethos.
As far as W.O. was concerned, it's on record as saying that to supercharge a Bentley engine is to pervert its design and corrupt its performance.
But one of the Bentley boys, Tim Birkin, believed that superchargers were the way forward, and if W.O. wouldn't build them, then he would. Birkin, although a millionaire in his own right, needed financing, and that came in the shape of Dorothy Paget.
Dorothy Paget was a real character. She is more associated with horse racing. At one time it is said she spent more on breeding stock than the Aga Khan.
I'm told Birkin was the only man in her life. I don't think anybody else mattered to her. Horses mattered, you see. Birkin happened to be the baronet, very racy man, scarf flying out behind his racing cars and that sort of thing. So perhaps this is for me.
With Paget's sponsorship, Birkin's team developed a supercharger for the existing 4.5-litre Bentley. Known as the Blower Bentley, it faced the mighty Mercedes SSK at Ards in Ulster in September 1929. At last, the best of British would take on the German might, with Bentley and Mercedes going head-to-head. Driving the Blower was Tim Birkin, and in the Mercedes was German champion Rudolf Caracciola.
Where Bentleys met Mercedes cars, both cars had the same character. Even if you drive either of these cars today, of the S or SS or the Bentleys, they are huge machines. They have a lot of torque and very difficult to handle. You had to be a real man to drive such a car. You know, steering is difficult, braking is tough. When once Caracciola asked the management, you have to increase the braking forces on the SSK, they said, you are racing to go fast and not to go slow, you know.
Caracciola's 7-litre Mercedes was also up against the new 6.5-litre Bentley. From the start, Caracciola in car number 70 led, and a fight began between the Bentleys and the supercharged Mercedes.
Mercedes, you see, had a clutch. You could bring the supercharger in by putting the throttle fully down. Then you heard a siren noise. Absolutely marvellous. Your tonic sort of motor car, V radiator, outside exhaust pipes. When you saw a clear road, you put your foot down, siren noise.
In driving rain, and with speeds of over 110 miles per hour, Caracciola lived up to his reputation as the Rain Master. No one could hold the Mercedes. One by one, the Bentleys dropped out, and Caracciola took the checkered flag. Tim Birkin's Blower Bentley could not match the mighty 7 litres of Mercedes and came in 11th. Birkin was unstinting in his praise of Caracciola and the Mercedes.
Whenever he passed me at that terrific speed, I felt no envy, only incredulity at his skill, his courage, and the endurance of his car.
With this success, Mercedes were euphoric. Not only had the Blower and the big Bentleys been beaten in a head-to-head, but perhaps the crown of Le Mans could now be taken back to Germany. Throughout the 1920s, Bentley's racing team had reigned supreme. But after their successful 1929 Le Mans, they suffered a real shock when at a race in Northern Ireland, a 7-litre supercharged Mercedes SSK had broken their domination of motorsport. But in Britain, they could still put on a good show at Brooklands. In October of that year, Brooklands, with its famous steeply banked track, introduced the 500-mile race. It was destined to become the fastest long-distance race in the world. Although Mercedes was not represented, entries came in briskly, and not surprisingly, Bentley was there in force. The Bentley boys entered their massive 4.5-litre, 6-litre and 6.5-litre giants. Tim Birkin raced in his new Amherst Villiers supercharged Bentley. From the outset, Birkin's Bentley, number 32, set the pace, lapping at over 120 miles per hour.
You know, there's no way that you'd catch me getting in one of those cars. I wouldn't want to drive a car which was running around on tyres that wide, no roll bar, no seat belts, capable of 120, 130 miles an hour, and racing wheel to wheel. Just doesn't entertain me at all.
Lap after lap, the Bentleys tore through the opposition, although Birkin's blower caught fire and he was forced to retire. Finally, Frank Clement took the checkered flag, with Sammy Davis a close second. Bentleys had won again.
We're both very happy to have won this wonderful race, and we think you're all very nice to have made such a fuss of us.
Yes, I quite agree. All I'm waiting for now is a drink.
By the start of the 1930s, the global recession was beginning to affect racing. At Le Mans, only 18 cars made it to the start line, the smallest entry ever seen. W.O. Bentley had entered an official team of 3 6.5-litre vehicles, and to take up the challenge, Mercedes had entered a private SSK.
During that time, Mercedes didn't have an official race team. They just participated with private drivers, and they gave these private drivers a company backing. So they gave these drivers a car and a mechanic.
Also in the lineup against Mercedes was Tim Birkin's new team of 2 supercharged or blower Bentleys. Although not part of Bentley's official team, they did now have W.O.'s blessing. Anything to try to beat the Germans.
He thought Birkin's a very fast and rather dangerous driver in his own right. If he can break up Mercedes and attract the crowd and that sort of thing, if he does to win the race, fine. But he was a tremendously fast driver.
Everything was now at stake for Bentley. During a pre-race party, someone had overheard that the weakness in the Mercedes was to keep making them use their supercharger. This snippet was to prove invaluable. From the outset, Caracciola took the lead ahead of the Bentleys. Time and again, Birkin's blower challenged for position, each time pushing the Mercedes harder and harder.
The Bentley guys used a very good tactic. They had numerous cars there, and they said we always have to chase this SS because the maximum power the Mercedes engine was achieving was only when you engaged the supercharger, which was not a permanent charger, but only for accelerating or overtaking and so on. And this tactic worked.
Lap after lap, the Bentleys hounded the Mercedes. And about midnight, the incredible battle was over when Caracciola was forced to retire.
Caracciola had to give up after 12 hours because the engine was blown. Yeah. So Bentley had a huge success. That is the real basic of this legend, the challenge between Mercedes and Bentley.
As W.O. had predicted, both blower Bentleys failed to finish, although Birkin, in car number 9, did break the lap record at 89 miles per hour. But it was Bentley's finest hour, with Bonato getting his hat-trick of 3 Le Mans wins.
Well, babe, you're making a habit of this. The third time you've done it in succession.
Yeah, third time they say is always lucky. Well, the average this year was better than it was last year. And up to the time the Mercedes packed up, we'd averaged over 80 miles an hour.
Had we really now?
Yes. But then, of course, we had it all our own way and cut down. And I think the average only just works out at about 75. And...
well, there was no need to go any faster. There's nobody to beat.
Well, we had nobody to beat but ourselves.
The Bentley boys enjoyed their moment of victory. But with widespread depression, the market for luxury motorcars was in free fall. And across the racing scene of Europe, new forces were about to take control, which were to have a devastating impact on Bentley. In 1928, Benito Mussolini, Italy's dictator, had created the Mille Miglia, a 1,000-mile road race around northern Italy as a showcase for the Italian motor industry. In Germany, an aristocratic racing driver called Manfred von Brauchitsch paid a visit to the leader of the National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler. At this time, Hitler was still looking to boost his popularity by winning over new supporters.
So I said to myself, he's got money to spend, as much as he likes. He's being supported by industry, but industry doesn't dare approach him. So I went to see him on the Obersalzberg. We walked up and down, him talking at me. I mean, he always had so much to say when he talked to anyone. He always talked very loudly, so everybody could hear him. So I asked him to give us at Daimler-Benz some money. And he said, Mr. von Braunsich, you will have the money once I'm in power.
But the economic depression was also having a marked effect on German manufacturers like Mercedes.
We had to change our whole production series, more to smaller cars, cars people could afford, because the luxury cars, they were so expensive, there was no market anymore for these cars. So we had actually in the company, we had some other problems than necessarily winning races.
When Hitler came to power, he kept his promise and offered Mercedes 450,000 Reichsmarks to design a world beater. He also offered cash rewards to the newly created company of Auto Union if they were able to win races and to break records.
People wonder why he had helped both teams. I said, think of a race of one maker wins all the time, but if we have two makes that appear to be against one another, which get more publicity. Porsche designed the Auto Union, very clever engineer. But they had just as good engineers as Mercedes. They were quite fabulous.
For Hitler, winning races was about more than just sport. It was a way to show that German technology was the best in the world and that Nazi Germany was going to be unbeatable on and off the racetrack. German industry went into overdrive in pursuit of Hitler's dream of supremacy, and soon the Mercedes W25 was revealed. Powered by a supercharged 3.3-litre engine, which produced 350 horsepower and a top speed of over 170 miles per hour, this car was a quantum leap in design. But it very nearly didn't start its first race. Having been painted in the German racing colour of white, the car was 1.5 kilos too heavy.
One of the guys decided scrap the colour of the car, and so they had 1.5 kilo less weight, and it was good enough for racing. So the car was driving in the blank alloy panels and was winning that first race. And that, of course, was a good sign. So the officials of Mercedes decided, we will use this silver color also for the future. And very shortly afterwards, a radio reporter called the cars Silver Arrow. And it was the birth of the Silver Arrows.
In its first race in 1934 at Nürburgring, Manfred von Braunsich drove the W25 Silver Arrow to victory.
Letting go of the steering wheel, shifting the gear stick, using the clutch, I can tell you, it made you feel like you had boiling water in your pants.
The rear-engine Auto Union, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, came second. This was to be the start of a new era of European competition and rivalry, and as Hitler had intended, it was the Germans who reigned supreme. Both Mercedes and Auto Union went head-to-head in a battle to conquer all opposition, employing drivers such as Caracciola, Rosemeyer, and Nuvolari. These giants dominated the European racing scene. Hitler's new Germany promoted speed and was committed to victory. The way to achieve this was by winning Grand Prix races. But there had been no state support for motor racing in Britain, and no saviour for Bentley. For Bentley Motors, its racing team, and the Bentley boys, the party was finally over when WO went into receivership. In 1931, Rolls-Royce had taken them over, and as a team, Bentley's never raced again. Although drivers like Tim Birkin tried to continue, his blower Bentleys never won a major race, and Dorothy Paget, who was not used to losing, withdrew her sponsorship.
She lost so much money with this supercharged car that late 1930 she just pulled the plug. It was a very sad chapter in the development of Bentley Motors.
Meanwhile, Le Mans was left to the Italians, French, and the surviving British. After Bentley's retirement, the Italian Alfa Romeo, with a little inducement from Mussolini, won 4 years in a row. British manufacturers such as MG, Riley, Lagonda and Aston Martin still flew the flag for Britain, but they couldn't recapture the glory days of Bentley. The era of the gentleman drivers was over. They could not compete with the growing professionalism of their continental rivals.
As soon as motorsport became involved with politics and economics, the whole ball game changed. Now we've got a different set of people in charge. We've got political influence. We want to win for the great glory of our particular country. We've got financial influence, which says, how much will that cost? And we can afford it, maybe to the detriment of something else. Now that, if you like, is not our way of doing things. And at that stage you see the ascendancy of the continental manufacturers over the British products.
As the 30s neared its end, Mercedes and Auto Union cars were unbeatable.
I think Bentley was definitely missing in Grand Prix sport in the 30s. Unfortunately, we didn't have any big British team during the 30s. There were only the Germans and the Italian, a little French, but that was it more or less. And to have a real European championship, definitely the English should have been part of the story.
For a brief 7 years, Bentley had taken on the best in the world and won. Their record of 5 Le Mans victories had created a legend out of the cars and their drivers. Mercedes, too, had earned its place in motorsport history. In the race to be the best, both companies had helped to shape the future of motor racing.
There was that crossover point where Bentley sort of faded away and then Mercedes came on board. They do get recalled as golden years because they were racing years. There was competition on the race circuit. Tooth and nail stuff. Drivers battling on the track, off the track. Manufacturers against each other. True racing manufacturers with a racing heritage which is second to none.